And so I return to that question that the Polish nobles asked themselves: how do we make this land productive? And the answer was to get Jews, to get the Jews to settle here. The Jews were ideal agents. They were not political competitors. They were not in any way liable to try to claim political power. And so Jews were invited in. But how do you get them to settle in the middle of nowhere? How do you get traditional Jews to settle in the middle of Alaska or in the middle of northern Manitoba? And the way the Polish nobility did this was to build company towns called miasteczka in Polish, and in Yiddish, the term was a shtetl. Now, there was nothing like the shtetl in the Jewish diaspora, not in Babylonia, not in Spain, not in Germany. There was no form of Jewish settlement in the whole history of the Jewish diaspora that corresponded to this developing Polish shtetl. What made the shtetl different? The shtetl usually had a Jewish majority. Now again, in Germany, Babylonia, Spain, Jews might live on a few streets, they might live in a certain neighborhood, but it was very rare that they were a majority. And many shtetls had a Jewish majority right up until World War II. The shtetls where my parents came from in 1939 were, in the case of my mother's shtetl, over 90% Jewish. And it's very important to understand that experience of East European Jewry, of living not as a minority, but as a majority. That so many East European Jews lived in settlements where they were a majority of the population. Not only that, but just as when the Jews left Spain to go to the Ottoman Empire, they now were speaking a language which made them different from the surrounding population. Judeo-Spanish in Spain was like the Gentile language. Judeo-German in the Rhineland was like the Gentile language. The Jews, as they went to the Ottoman Empire and went to Poland, were now speaking languages that made them different from their Gentile neighbors. The language of the shtetl was Yiddish. And Yiddish was not the same as Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian. Another difference between the shtetl and other forms of Jewish settlement was that elsewhere in the diaspora, Jews tended to congregate in a few particular occupations: money lending, jewelry, and so forth. In the shtetl, Jews were in every occupation, from the very rich to the very poor. And that variety of occupation was a contributing factor in the development of a rich Jewish folklore. Each shtetl owned by a Polish nobleman had a charter which promised the Jews certain privileges. The noble promised that there would be no market days on the Sabbath or Jewish holidays. Each shtetl had a basic network of Jewish institutions: the mikveh, the cemetery, the synagogue. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that Jews lived only in shtetls belonging to the Polish nobility. Jews also lived in cities that didn't belong to the nobles. They lived in Lublin, they lived in Vilna, they lived in Krakow. The difference was, though, that in these cities, in the royal cities, you had competitors who didn't want Jews living there. You had Christian merchants, you had Christian guilds who saw the Jews as unwelcome competitors. And many of these cities were able to pass laws which forbade Jewish settlement. In Krakow, Jews had to move to a separate Jewish section called Kazimierz. In Warsaw, there was a law forbidding Jewish settlement after 1527, although Jews found ways to get around that. But in the private towns that belonged to the nobles decided who would live in those towns and who wouldn't. And the nobles had much more in common economically with the Jews than they did with what we might call a Christian middle class. The basis of the relationship between the nobility and the Jew, the nexus of the economic relationship, was the so-called lease. In Polish, it was the arenda, A-R-E-N-D-A. And to make a long story short, just to simplify things, a Jew would buy a long-term lease from a noble. He'd pay a lot of money up front, and he would then get the right to cut down a forest. He would hire others to get subleases, who in turn would hire peasants to chop down the trees, to drag the lumber to the banks of rivers, to put them onto rafts, to float the rafts down the rivers to Danzig, to sell the wood. The Jew would take the risks, and hopefully he would keep the profits if he made more money than what he paid the Polish landlord. Now, this was the basis of the system. It gets very complicated, but what it meant is that Jews needed other Jews who would help them make sure that they profited from the terms of their lease. Now, a fundamental part of the leaseholding system was what we might call a big insurance policy that the nobles needed to protect themselves from the falling price of grain. Polish grain began to decline in price in the late 17th century especially. And that hedge to protect the nobles was the making of vodka, the so-called propinacja, turn grain into liquor. Make sure that the peasants only bought vodka officially produced by the Jews who were leasing the propinacja from the landlord, making sure that peasants drank only at the taverns run by the Jews. Now, this didn't make the Jews very popular with the peasantry, but it certainly played an enormous role in the local economy. And it accounted for a very large part of the revenues that the landlords got, especially in the 18th century. Now, the shtetl was also kind of like a battery. It was a battery in that it activated economic relationships between the landlord, the Jews, and the peasants in, say, a area around 20 miles from the center of the shtetl. The cornerstone of that relationship, that economic relationship, was the market day. Each shtetl had a market square. On one side of the market square was always a Catholic church to remind everybody who the shtetl belonged to. The peasants would come from 10, 15 miles away, as far as their horse could take them, and they'd come with goods to sell. the Jews would buy those goods. The peasants with money in their pockets would then buy things from the Jewish stores. And in many cases, that relationship continued up to the beginning of the Second World War. The shtetl was also a base for Jews who would leave their homes on a Sunday morning and spend 5 days in the countryside, sleeping in barns, trading with peasants, fixing their clothes, fixing their furniture, and then coming back to the shtetl for the Sabbath. The Jews and the peasants were like intimate strangers. They were close and yet far. The peasants and the Jews knew each other on a first-name basis. For the most part, they lived together in peace. Every once in a while, that peaceful relationship would be, euphemistically speaking, rudely interrupted. Just as in Bosnia, we might say Muslims, Orthodox, Catholics live side by side, and then one day they turn on each other. But this was a face-to-face society of personal relationships. I recall that when I went with my sisters to my mother's former shtetl in 1996, there were women in that shtetl who came up to my sister and said, "You look just like your mother." In other words, they remembered our family, they remembered what we looked like, and those memories did not fade after 50 years. This character of the shtetl as a face-to-face society was also a hallmark of how Jews related to each other. Everybody had a nickname. My grandfather was known as Sam the American because he lived in the United States. If a woman gave birth 6 months after she got married, she might be known as the Beria. A Beria is a woman who does things well and does things fast, who's able to get things done. Some of these nicknames were not very flattering, but that too was part of shtetl society. The relationship of the Jews to the Polish nobility was also complicated, but in a different way. The Jews and the nobles were also familiar strangers. In some ways, and I stress in some ways, there's a certain similarity to relations between whites and blacks in the Old South. They knew each other, they grew up together, but there was a strong sense you're in one caste and we're in another caste. The Polish nobles treated the Jews basically with contempt. Jewish values were very different from the values of the Polish nobility, but at the same time, the Jews were part of the landscape. And there was one Polish proverb, when times are bad, go to the Jew. And the Jews knew that the nobles needed them. So on the one hand, you hear Jewish stories of cruel nobles who beat Jews, nobles who lock them in barns, nobles who exploit them. But on the other hand, you hear many stories of how the poets, or the local Polish nobleman, was the foundation and the mainstay of the local Jewish economy.